All right, so I'm kind of learning as I go on all this streaming stuff. I apologize for all that, but I'll figure it out eventually. Um, Yesterday, let's see, let's not close the wrong windows here. Okay, so yesterday, what we did was I kind of went through reactpatterns.com and just kind of went through, reacquainted myself with all of the things that I had talked about. And I was a little bit kind of disappointed with the way that some things were being described, more so than just kind of the syntax of things that had changed, features that had changed. I was actually pretty minimal. One thing that is kind of interesting about this as a resource is that you can jump in any of these patterns at any point if you have a question about one specifically. But it's also kind of like a linear read. Like one thing kind of leads into the next. So I want to be able to retain some of that. So I want to explore, like if I were to rewrite this today, kind of like kind of go through each of these. So I'm going to do that. I have code sandbox open here, and kind of the way I have it set up is this is just a kind of standard sandbox. And then I have all of those categories as comments. And then I have kind of the topic here, and then I'll just make a export a component over here for anything for all the topics. So let's just dive right in. Whoops. You're going to see what a lousy programmer I am. Let's see, functional component example. Okay, perfect. This is what we need. So I guess what I'm going to do is, I guess this will be no props. Will be the first example. Okay, so we got our no props example. Now the second example that we have in there, so that's just super basic, is that we take props and do props.name. Okay. Call that name prop. Okay. Does it have a fuzzy finder? Oh my gosh, it does. Look at that. Okay, so let's go into our topic. I wish I could split these. Unfortunately, I don't think I can. So we'll say name Michael. Great. So the next one is we want to do a default prop. Now, I'm actually curious to know if people still use default props. So I guess how that would look is I would say default props on functional components. Obviously, if you're using a class component, you need those default props in all of the lifecycle hooks. However, since this does not have those lifecycle hooks, I kind of I guess my preference is not to use default props because I find it kind of unsightly and cumbersome. So yeah, so I'll do an example just because it is a feature, and the other one you have to kind of do some more advanced stuff. So let's do that. Name guest. Let's add a little punctuation there, spice it up. Okay. Let me reorganize this window so I don't have to keep fuzzy finding my way back to the code. Okay, so now if I delete this, should see guest. I'm not exporting the right component. Okay, so default prop works. And then if I do provide a name, perfect. Now, I think that is all that I need. These three things are really all there is to this kind of basic functional component. So I'm going to call that done for now and move on to JSX spread attributes. Now, I had actually, in looking at this yesterday, I had kind of thought that this order might be better, that destructuring those values out might be a better kind of like precursor to spreading them back on to kind of an object, passing it through. I mean, it's questionable. I remember struggling over that decision the last time, but kind of reading it afresh a couple years later, didn't feel quite like I was. The order didn't feel right, so I want to flesh that out. Let's do a destructuring. Okay. I think what we're going to do is we're going to start from this default props example. Okay, so we're going to take this from destructuring. Definitely don't want to type that twice. I did anyway. Dang it. React is not defined. Okay, so we start with our example from functional components, which is the last one where we just use this prop object. Now, in theory, the first example would be I would take that name off of props and use that there. So that's example one. Example two, let's call this destructuring with, I can't remember what those are called. Default values. Default parameters. Yeah. I should probably link that. So destructuring with default parameters. So the default props would go away. This is what we expect to see. And we would move the guest up here. Now that's my preference. This is my preference right now. when I'm writing this type of component, just because I don't know. The other one, like kind of hanging that little default props off of this function is just a little unsightly. I like to keep it all together if I can. Yeah. So this feels good. Again, if you're using classes, this isn't going to get you very far because you're not going to get any of those default props in your lifecycle methods, which could be very frustrating for you. But here, I think that's good. The final example would be the rest. Or rest parameters. So this will be destructuring with default and rest. Oh my gosh. And rest parameters. So in this case, I would take, now, even though I'm going to use JSX spread in the next example, because this isn't actually the regular JavaScript spread because it's happening in this tag that's actually a JSX feature. But I do need to introduce rest here because this is actually happening in JavaScript land. Oops, I guess. Yeah, sorry. I did all that work in the wrong place. Okay, so this is all working appropriately. And then where I want to leave this one off is to lead into spread attributes using rest props. Okay, so yeah, so this section is mostly done. We start kind of like with the case, with the previous case where we just have a functional component with default props. We then move into kind of this destructuring assignment where we can say, oh, I should probably add an intermediate example. So destructuring assignment where we still have everything here. But we just peel off the value that we want from that object, and then kind of show that we're removing. Oh my gosh. That was this example. Sorry, folks. Okay, so this is good. Show destructuring here. Show that we can kind of move this default value into this with default parameters. And then we kind of move on with default and rest to say that you can collect all of the rest of these here. Great. And then we'll lead into rest spread. I'm liking that so far in theory. So we'll call this done. So now we need to make a new file, JSX spread attributes. And let's start from our last place where we're at last. Okay, so this is where we left off with the destructuring assignment portion. So I'd like to, I guess the only next step is I need to maybe link to the feature JSX spread attributes. That's a gist. That's not what I need. Oh my gosh. There we go. JSX in depth. Spread attributes. Let's get that link and include it here. Okay, so what do we... So JSX... I'm going to just rewrite the whole thing so I kind of know what's going on. So default name is guest. We're going to collect the rest of those props in a local props variable. Return that h1 component with hi name. And the only additional thing that this will have is to spread those props. Now I would like to test that out by, okay, so we're doing the right, so let's say name, style, I think that should work. Oh, importing the wrong stuff still. JSX spread attributes. There's an error in this file. Oh my gosh, 2 dots right here. Where that third dot at? Where my third dot at? Perfect. Okay, so we have topic, customizing the name, and then this is just getting passed through via spread attributes. So we're taking those rest props and spreading them on. Perfect. All right. I'm just trying to think if there's anything else we need to cover in that before. Like, I'm wondering if I need to reinforce that. What's the next section? So let's call this done. Okay, so I do talk about, so kind of the next step of this is that idea of a proxy component. And it feels to me right now that this is a natural extension of the topic that we just covered. It would be nice to go into that while we're still in functional component land before we go into covering children. It feels more kind of naturally connected. Yeah, because this is kind of a children's section. And this one's kind of an outlier. Actually, both of these are. I wonder if it would make sense to bring those up. Because all of that happens before we address classes at all. Then this would be kind of handling events and composition. If I spelled that right. events and data flow. Yeah, I think that might be better. The only outlier is this conditional rendering. Which may, whoops, lost my space on my keyboard. Which may fit fine in between. Yeah, let's go with that. Cool. I'm gonna say, instead of making a bunch of new files, I'm just gonna make one new file and call it for now fancy functional component types. Proxy components. That name is so stupid, and I don't think it really means anything. But it is, I feel like, a good base level concept for these other types. So in that, I'm going to kind of pull in all of these. Let me delete those. Okay, so we end the previous section with this JSX spread attributes and properties. We're going to have this kind of concept of a proxy component. Go back to index, import that. Proxy components. Pluralization always gets me. Okay, so we're looking good with our previous example. I'm going to read what I said here about proxy components. Back to top would be nice. So buttons are everywhere in web apps, and every one of them must have the type attribute set to button. Okay. I do like this button example because I feel like the example is clear. I think I could even further flesh it out by kind of, or further tie it to the previous example by having this type button as a default prop. Because statement is not true. Some of them would have a type of input or type submit, I guess, if it was at the end of the form. And by default, there's submit. So writing this attribute hundreds of times is error prone. We can write a higher level component to proxy props to lower level button component, a lower level button component. Yeah, I think that's still fair and relevant. Let's see. So we'll call this I'm not even sure at this point if I even know what the technical definition of proxy is. I think there's actually an issue with recommendations for this. Conditional rendering of design changes, yes. I swear there was one. I guess not. Okay, the authority to represent someone else, especially in voting, a figure that can be used to represent the value of something in a calculation. Neither of those. I'm sure there's a better word for that. So we'll call this a proxied button for now until I either find someone else that gave this thing a good name or we'll land on something better. So the example that we were I was using is button. So we're rendering out a button, and let's just call this button. Oh yeah, this is just topic. So let's kill this. Button is not defined. It's not. Man, my spelling is atrocious today. Okay, so we don't need this. So we'll spread those props out. And everything should work. We have to update the example a little bit. With see what's going on. Unexpected token. Oh, I know what that is. Did not close my tag. Okay, so we have button text. The example here was that we wanted to provide a default here. Ooh, come on. So what we're looking to apply here is that default of type button. Using the kind of like inspector in Code Sandbox is not ideal, but we won't have to do this much. Okay, cool. So I think that's a good starter example. That's kind of all we have at the moment here. Use button in place of button. We ensure that it's type. Okay, cool. We could go one further and express the default. Maybe just to, I don't know if it's a good thing, but maybe just to reinforce the, what are they called? Destructuring assignment. All right. So if I want to reinforce the destructuring assignment, I could say the type of this button is going to default to button. But really you could pass in whatever you wanted. So here, I guess I still have to control that, unfortunately. So I guess this is where, okay, so I discovered something. So this is awesome. This is where default props would be nice because otherwise I'd have to say type, oh my gosh. Type is type, right? So that's not ideal because I'm gonna have to do that for everything, or everything that I kind of like peel off and assume some level of control over. It would be nicer to kind of have that as a default prop. Okay, so now if we so we've set the default prop to button. Maybe I'll call this button. Oh, I'm defining this twice. So what do I want to call this? This is naming is hard. Okay, so if we go back over here and I change this specifically to be type submit, and I find this silly button again, that works. Great. Now, ideally, we'd validate that so that you can't put random types, but I don't really want to talk about prop types or using a language to do that for you. So we'll leave that as an exercise to the user. So personal note, this is why default props are great. There's no point in, oh, what is that called? Okay. So we got the kind of like basic proxy component down. We need to do a style now. Let's stick with this button. I think that would be best, as our first lady would suggest. Be best. So we'll call this a style component. And what we'll do is we'll add a default class to this. Now, this is so this is generally what I'm after. However, if someone were to do style component class other, now we're only going to get other and not button. So these default props, this is where they typically break down. So this is where I have to kind of jump back into these, structuring these. And here, I don't actually want to handle it with default props the way that I'm doing type. So we say class name. And right now, we'll just call that class name. So we'll just pass that through. So all we've done at this point is we've kind of like peeled this off and like deliberately placed it back on there. That is buying us nothing, but now we have the capacity to kind of manipulate this. So I'll do that with, we'll use button. So we'll create an array and call that join with a space in there. And I'll show you how that works. So if I say class name button primary now, I check that out. It should say show button and button primary. It is not. What I do. If I were a better programmer, it would. Doing that default, exporting that default button. There we go. So button and button primary. Why don't I actually include a library so instead of just inspecting that the attributes are right, we can actually see see how that works. So can I just do that? Is that a real thing? Man, a full CDN just for Bootstrap. That's incredible. I just need the CSS, please. Add resource. Oh, hell yeah. Hell yeah. Cool. So now if we go back to our index here, we could change, so we can delete this all together and we'll get just that default button styling. Perfect. Nope. Class name. Button. It's probably what? Danger. Warning. What a weird name for a yellow button. But yeah, okay, cool. So that all works. I'm not sure exactly how deeply I want to go into style components. Because I feel like it's a topic that could warrant its own page entirely. But I guess for the sake of it, let's just try it out. Or let's move forward on it a little bit. So what I would do, I had kind of alluded to how I would do this yesterday, is that if I were to make a module full of these types of components, so I would call this maybe styled button or something. Yeah. And then kind of I would have a primary button, which would just take props and return a styled button. Spreading props. And I would, let's see. I guess I still need to merge. Yeah, so I would still need to merge class name. So let's take class name off and grab the rest of the props. And do that same thing. Style component is not defined. Okay, let's export primary button. Okay, so this is going to be our primary button now. Yes. Now, I guess just for example, what I would do on the import side, or kind of how I would handle this, is I would have primary button. Let's do like danger button. Actually, I hate this terminology. I'm going to call that destroy button. And create button. Except I don't know what the green. Oh, success, I think it is. Okay, so we got primary, destroy, and create. So let's give ourselves some space to do all these. Sorry for all the typing. It happens sometimes. Okay, so let's export these now from the styled button side. I'm just gonna copy these, and you'll notice there is some duplication. That's duplication that I'm totally fine with, because I want to be able to change one of these without changing, without affecting the others. So this is going to be success. This is going to be warning. No. Crap. Cannot remember the name of that one. Danger. Danger, Will Robinson. We get it right? Cool. Okay, so all of these use this kind of styled base component, which applies that button class. And then they additionally do their own kind of merging of these class names. Again, there is this repetition, this kind of predictable repetition. You could take it a step further and like add those as props to this base class, but I don't love that idea, because then like if at any point in the future you decide to change implementations or add kind of an additional button, it just gets a little bit confusing, and I would prefer to at some point be able to kind of swap this out and say like CSS class styled button, Actually, let's do that. CSS class styled button. Oh my gosh. Okay, so we have the CSS class styled buttons. Now, if we wanted to do another button, with another styling method entirely. So let's say we still want to use that same base class. But we want to handle the rest with style. We want to merge some styles on there. I'm not rendering that on this side. What did I call that? Some other button? Some other button. Some other button is not defined. Duh, background color. I am so stupid sometime. Cool. So kind of that still feels at place in this like system, and we can see that this is styled differently. I mean, you wouldn't do this, but maybe you import two different types of like, base CSS styles, or you're kind of migrating from one type of styling components with CSS to like CSS and JS, to be able to keep all of these components in one place instead of kind of having that mental tax of like, oh, these types of components are styled one way, these other types are styled another way, is pretty nice. 1220. Okay, cool. So that I think is good. Let me see if there's anything else that we talk about in style components. See, we have a button that uses a class to be styled primary. Perfect. Now this, I do actually go into this technique, which I think is faulty. So I guess I'll update all of these things to account for that. Again, like right now, yeah, I would use the technique that I'm using, and even if I wasn't, I would do something like kind equals primary. Okay, cool. Let's see. I know layout was around here. I'm not sure why these are separated because they're so closely aligned, but whatever. Oh, layout. So layout uses a class component, so we can trigger should component update. Layout components result in some form of static DOM element. I don't know if this is kind of universally accepted, but I'm willing to risk it. I might not need to update frequently, if ever. Consider a component that renders two children side by side. Okay. I think this is still valuable knowledge to have. I'm sure that some people are experiencing some perf problems around layout thrashing. Is that what you call it? Layout thrashing? So these examples, honestly, I think that one is fine. So I'm not going to come back. I'm not going to deal with that right now. Kind of fatiguing a little bit, so. Oops, what happened? Where's my Safari at? Is evidenced by my growing hair. So this sucks. So I don't know. Something's definitely wrong with my my live stream buffering. Please use keyframe frequency of 4 seconds or less. Currently, keyframes are not being used. Okay. Screenshot that because I want these not to suck in the future. All right. So where are we? So that's good for now. I might do, let's see. So we got through layout components, conditional rendering. I think conditional rendering, I just totally glossed over that one when we were reviewing yesterday because I think that it's pretty clear what these are doing. Fair enough. Yeah, so I think that's good for now. I will do another live stream where I jump into these children types. I think that section generally needs a lot of work in between all of these types of children. In particular, this render props one was not ideal. And yeah. All right, cool. So awesome. Thanks. I hope that this was at all helpful. And yeah, see you next time.